At one point, Tom Araya yelled about death, Satan, blood, and lunacy with such ferocity that even the devil was silenced. Then he disappeared. No lengthy farewell tour, no startling autobiography. There was no soul-stirring podcast, just a man leaving the stage in silence with no explanation. He was seen in Texas years later, riding a lawnmower, feeding cows, caring for poultry, and tending to plants while sporting a plaid shirt. He was the once terrifying voice of thrash metal, but no one recognized him. Why? Why would someone want to be silent before morning when they used to yell about hell every night? Why would a figure like Araya, who for almost 40 years carried Slayer on his shoulders, abandon the spotlight with no remorse? To leave everything behind and withdraw into a field as though he had never been there, what did he see, feel, and lose? No one has fully revealed the truth that lies behind the cries, those razor-sharp eyes, and that growling bass that sounded like a demon's heartbeat. And we must start at the beginning in order to comprehend that man. Nobody could have predicted that a young Chilean boy who adored the Beatles would one day shake the world with his scream. Childhood. On June 6, 1961, Tomás Enrique Araya Díaz was born in Vina del Mar, a stunning Chilean seaside city. However, the sea had little to do with his early years. Migration, loss, and a persistent feeling of not belonging anyplace were all connected to it. In Southgate, California, where Latino immigrants had to work twice as hard simply to be half recognized, the Araya family fled their nation when he was just 5 years old, bringing with them 2 young children and a shaky dream. Tom's dad was employed at a factory that made leather. His mom worked in housekeeping. Both art and so-called rebellious music were out of their sphere of influence. But Tom's destiny was altered by his brother Cisco, who lived in that little home in a low-income area. Cisco was a guitarist. The two brothers would perform songs by the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, and later Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath after school. Tom wasn't supposed to become a rock sensation with his first bass. It was just to support his brother. The quiet child in the background had a musical energy that could rock an entire genre, but no one could have predicted it. Tom was not an athlete. He wasn't a particularly good student. His peers made fun of him for being quiet and a little weird, for having an unusual last name, and for being an immigrant. He didn't require pals, though. In order for its music to speak for him, he needed a bass and a world. Even though no one, including the Chilean youngster, saw it coming, it is how he became the most lethal element in thrash metal. Early career. Prior to yelling death threats, Tom Araya had saved lives. The statement isn't a metaphor. He actually worked in a hospital, suctioning mucus, checking oxygen levels, intubating patients, and wearing a mask. Araya started working at Brand Medical Center, where life and death were a part of every day, after finishing a respiratory therapy technician training program. Few people realized, however, that when he left the hospital, he would return home, turn on his amplifier, grab his bass, and yell angry lyrics about genocide and war. Tom once claimed that although medicine was stable and practical, his heart was in another place. Araya led 2 separate lives while his friends concentrated on going to colleges or seeking employment. Screaming at night, recovering throughout the day. He was strengthened rather than broken by that contradiction. Araya wasn't a street punk or wild rebel when Slayer first began to take shape in garage rehearsals. The only one with a reliable job and money to invest was him. And that is just what he did. None of the band members had enough money for studio time in 1983 when Slayer was ready to record their debut album, Show No Mercy. To pay for the entire recording, Araya surreptitiously pocketed his hospital paycheck, money earned via blood, sweat, and tears. Although it was a modest act, it helped to create the foundation for the extreme music empire. Slayer might have been just another garage band stuck in Southgate without Tom Araya, but he took a chance. For a type of music that broke all conventions, with the expertise of someone who had formerly held a breathing tube. And he didn't turn around. Joining Slayer. Kerry King had no idea that he was going to alter the course of heavy metal history when he called Tom Araya one afternoon in 1981. It all began with the simple statement, "I have a band. A bass player is needed. Do you want to try it?" At the time, Araya was treating patients with respiratory failure and taking lung pressure readings at a hospital in Los Angeles. However, he replied in the affirmative because, beneath the mask and scrubs, there was a man who was so desperate for music that he would give anything up for it. With worn-out amplifiers and a drum equipment worse than a high school band's, Slayer's first practice was held in a stuffy garage. But a mad spirit was rising in that stuffy air. Dave Lombardo, Jeff Hanneman, and Kerry King performed as if the devil himself were after them. Tom Araya was standing in the middle, calm and peaceful, but the walls appeared to split when he opened his mouth. Araya was not taught how to sing like that. His voice was raw and guttural, unlike anything else at the time, and he screamed out of instinct. It was genuine, like the cries of a soul that had lived on the brink of death in a hospital, even though it wasn't lovely or flawless. And Slayer had discovered its last component at that same moment. Slayer had neither a sponsor nor a record label. When a band played songs about blood, the Holocaust, and Satan at machine gun speed, no one wanted to invest in them. What then did they do? Their debut album was created by them. The only one with a reliable job and income was Araya. He took money out of his hospital income to pay for studio expenses, press records, and rent a van to transport equipment to shows, not to save for retirement or purchase a home. It was not a careless choice. It was a silent sort of sacrifice, a decision between truth and comfort. Show No Mercy was founded in 1983. Rumbling riffs, raw sound, and death-themed lyrics. You wouldn't listen to this music to unwind. When you wanted to tear down the four walls inside your skull, you played this game. Record labels first disregarded it. The underground accepted it as gospel for a vengeful age, but stores refused to carry it. The misfits, the disinterested teenagers, the children who didn't identify with pop or disco. They all located Slayer. For alone, Tom Araya continued to attempt to balance both worlds. He worked hospital shifts during the day. He sung of slaughter at night. Then, however, everything went south. Slayer received a European tour invitation. Their greatest chance to date. Araya requested and was denied time off from the hospital. Even worse, he had additional shifts planned. Until Tom Araya stood up one day after being threatened with termination for not committing to his schedule, faced his boss in the eye, and declared, "Then I'm fired." Excellent. My full-time job is playing in a band. No drama, no reluctance. Only a man who was aware of his destination. With patched-up equipment and a harsh schedule that had them sleeping in the van, eating instant noodles, and playing like the world was ending tomorrow, Slayer started their first tour in a dilapidated van. Fans found them even more horrifying and legendary since they weren't featured on MTV or accepted by the media. Tom Araya is shown in the center of each of Slayer's early pictures, glaring into the camera like a gatekeeper to hell without grinning or growling. He didn't have to say anything. All he had to do was shout. Araya was the one who lit the fuse if Show No Mercy was a bomb. Slayer was no longer a band searching for its identity after that. They were a hurricane that was poised to rip through the metal world as a whole, having already torn through the underground. Professional achievement. Some albums are good. Some albums are successful, and some albums alter the very fabric of a whole genre. Slayer's Rain and Blood falls within the third category. After releasing two critically praised underground albums, Hell Awaits and Show No Mercy, Slayer achieved a significant milestone in 1986. In an odd alliance between rap and thrash metal, they signed with Def Jam Recordings, the renowned hip-hop label that Rick Rubin co-founded. That none could have anticipated. Despite being an outsider, Rick Rubin had a keen sense of raw energy. He was not there to make Slayer more lenient. Instead, he assisted them in turning all of their anger into a powerful weapon that was more lethal and pure than before. Slayer didn't consider the market, radio play, or any form of censorship. When he was recording Rain and Blood, they had only one thing in mind. Increase your speed, weight, and force to the point where no one else can follow. Angel of Death, the opening track, sent listeners directly to hell in the first few seconds. Long, sharp, and air-splitting, Tom Araya's first scream wasn't meant as a greeting. It was a declaration, a smack in the face, and a warning to the whole metal community. The song described the cruel experiments conducted at Auschwitz by the notorious Nazi physician Joseph Mengele. Similar to how killers frequently defend their actions, the lyrics only described without passing judgment or offering an explanation. And for that reason, it was scarier than any horror book. Slayer was charged with endorsing Nazism right away. The record was not carried by retail outlets. A few distributors withdrew. For fear of public outrage, CBS Records declined to distribute it in the United States. Slayer didn't give up, though. They were aware that they were in danger. And for that same reason, uncompromising rebellion, they were dealing with something tangible in art. The duration of Rain and Blood was a mere 28 minutes and 58 seconds. There are only 10 tracks, like 10 consecutive cuts, with no lengthy intros or ballads to lighten the mood. With drums crashing like bombs, guitars grinding like chainsaws, and Tom Araya screaming in the middle like his soul was being torn apart with each take, they were all destructive and blazingly fast. The odd thing, though, was that Slayer's first commercial success came from this extreme album. It made it onto the Billboard 200, which at the time was practically unimaginable for extreme metal. More significantly, it became into a symbol that impacted a whole generation of bands, including Slipknot, Lamb of God, Cannibal Corpse, and Sepultura. Slayer didn't use marketing gimmicks to try to expand their following after Rain in Blood. They continued to produce darker, harder, and riskier albums without writing hits, inviting guest musicians, or playing MTV's game. Seasons in the Abyss, 1990, God Hates Us All, 2001, Divine Intervention, 1994, South of Heaven, 1988, and Tom Araya remained in the middle of the stage, yelling as though each song were a soul exorcism. Eyes of the Insane, a somber song about PTSD and American soldiers after battle, earned Slayer their first Grammy in 2007, nearly 30 years after they had been shunned by the mainstream music industry. This time, Araya's voice was one of a soul warped by harsh reality rather than merely one of rage. Their song Final Six, which was included in the Christ Delusion edition, earned them another Grammy a year later. Awards, however, were never as significant to Araya as the audience's quiet just before he yelled the opening sentence. He didn't require praise. The audience's eyes were filled with enough horror. Tom Araya was always the calming influence on Slayer, even though the other members occasionally became enmeshed in disputes, drunkenness, or internal conflicts. He didn't battle for leadership, give provocative interviews, or chase attention. However, he was the storm's gravitational center as the music began. Slayer toured as if they were racing the end of the world from 1986 until the late 2010s. Tom Araya strode onto the stage night after night and yelled as if he were letting out something that words could never express, despite the fact that his neck tightened, his back started to hurt, and his sleep had disappeared. Rain in Blood was more than just the album that made Slayer famous. It was Tom Araya's permanent mark. He was a former hospital employee who was now standing in the center of a metal hurricane and yelling things that most people wouldn't dare believe. Not to mention health setback and the end of headbanging. There is an unwritten rule in the metal community. You're not really living the music if you're not headbanging. And Tom Araya was the one who transformed the deed into a holy rite. Thousands of performances. He slammed his skull to the beat thousands of times. His long hair whipped like a steel tornado across his back. Tom Araya did more than just sing when the riff started. He threw his whole body into the song, causing his shoulders to shake and his neck to crack, and the audience to scream along as if they were mesmerized. However, he was unaware that he was gradually and bitterly paying the price after 20 years of living at that extremity. Araya started experiencing numbness in his left arm in 2008. After shows, it initially lasted only a few minutes before extending to hours. From his neck to his shoulder and then down to his forearm, he felt a tingling feeling like to needles. His hands began to shake and slow down while he was playing the bass. However, he remained silent. No words to the tour doctor, no complaints. One of the most intense touring stints in Slayer's history was currently underway. It was nearly unheard of in his career until he dropped his pick in the middle of a song one night in Europe. Araya asked for a thorough medical examination following that performance. An MRI showed a serious cervical disc herniation, pinched nerves, and the possibility of partial arm paralysis if surgery was not performed quickly. Tom Araya had surgery in January 2010. In a complicated technique known as a cervical fusion, doctors removed damaged discs, replaced them with artificial spacers, and used metal plates to fuse the bones together. The doctor was unharmed after the procedure. "You'll be back here in a year if you continue to smash your head like you did previously. And we might not be able to correct it the next time." Araya was aware that a piece of his identity had recently been surgically removed, but he also realized that he had to give up the thing that fans most connected him with if he wanted to live to see his children grow up and continue performing on stage for a few more years. Following surgery, Araya was no longer able to wear a bass as he formerly did. Pain and the possibility of re-injury resulted from a standard strap pulling the weight of the instrument directly into his surgically healed neck. His brother, Cisco Araya, who introduced Tom to music, provided the answer. In order to support the bass's lower body and transfer its weight from the neck to the hips and shoulders, Cisco created a special belt that resembles a weightlifter's support belt but has been modified, lowering the cervical spine's pressure. That belt allowed Araya to keep performing without having to worry about collapsing again. The audience was never informed. He was still strapped to his bass and wearing his equipment on stage, but a homemade medical support system was hidden under his shirt, a quiet testament to his willpower. Slayer made a comeback to the stage in a U.S. performance in March 2010. The crowd yelled, the drums thundered, the lights went out, yet Tom Araya stood motionless as he emerged. No leaning into the microphone or headbanging. He started to sing as he stood like a statue, his face gloomy and eyes chilly. At first, some admirers believed he was ill. Others thought it was a new artistic direction, but by the end of the performance, they realized that this was his new style of performance. Ironically, his silence just served to increase his scary presence. Araya's voice howled like suppressed emotions exploding through a single outlet, and in the midst of the commotion, he resembled a silent judge reading a decision to the world. Araya never again gave a headbang. He never apologized, though. No justifications. No awkwardness. He merely responded, "I miss that feeling, but I'm still here," when asked about the shift. "I can still yell. That's sufficient." That could have been a setback for another artist, but for Tom Araya, it was a victory of adaptability, audience loyalty, and survival instinct. Even if Slayer's stage was still burning, the man who used to slam his skull hundreds of times every night was now motionless in the middle, serving as a living reminder of the harm caused by time and a reminder that he could still rock the globe even if he was not moving. Slayer's dissolution and retirement decision. November 30, 2019. Los Angeles' The Forum. As a last act of sacrifice, blood-red lights spilled down on stage. The last chords of Slayer's farewell show were being played. Slayer was the band that once sent the globe into a frenzy with their speed, ferocity, and hellish lyrics. It was all coming to an end after over 40 years. The sound ceased as Angel of Death came to an end. However, nobody went. The whole place was motionless. Nobody was certain of what would occur next. Tom Araya then came forward. No long thank you speech, no tears, no dramatic farewell. For a long time, Araya remained silent and simply stood there observing the gathering. The eyes belonged to a man who had completed his voyage. Though they weren't wet, his eyes said everything that words couldn't. Relief, remorse, gratitude, and an inexplicable grief. A few fans started crying. Others gripped the barricade and stood still. They realized that this would be the final instance. November 30, 2019. Los Angeles' The Forum. As a last act of sacrifice, blood-red lights spilled down on stage. Slayer. The band that had sent the globe into a frenzy with their speed, rage, and hellfire lyrics was playing the last notes of their last performance. It was all coming to an end after over 40 years. The sound ceased as Angel of Death came to an end. However, nobody went. The whole place was motionless. Nobody was certain of what would occur next. Tom Araya then came forward. No sobs, no grandiose goodbye. Don't make a protracted thank you speech. For a while, Araya remained silent and simply stood there observing the crowd. The eyes belonged to a man who had completed his voyage. Though they weren't wet, his eyes said everything that words couldn't. Relief, remorse, gratitude, and an inexplicable grief. While some spectators stood still, clutching the barricade, others sobbed. They realized that this would be the final instance. In one of his final interviews, Araya remarked, "I've screamed enough. On stage, I've given it my all. Right now, I want to be silent and listen to my kids talk." There was no tribute DVD, no live broadcast, and no lavish farewell event hosted by Slayer. They simply went on tour, performed as if the last few years had never happened, and then vanished. A quiet farewell, much as Tom Araya had lived his entire life. No grievances. There was no remorse or yearning for youth, just a guy who knew when to stop and did so before everything faded into obscurity. Tom Araya disappeared from the media after that farewell night. No talk programs, no speeches, and no clickbait headlines. Only people were aware. He went back to Texas, where he now resides on a sizable ranch with cows, chickens, and a few dogs with his wife and kids. And peaceful afternoons devoid of guitar music. Araya no longer screams. He doesn't have to. He has yelled for a whole generation already. Private life. Despite having grown up as a devoted Catholic, Tom Araya once yelled about Satan. Araya was raised in a conventional Chilean household that included nightly prayers, weekly church services, and a crucifix on the wall. The fact that their kid would be the face of a band accused of praising the devil decades later was unthinkable for his parents. However, Tom Araya found it odd that both could live together. "I was born and reared Catholic," Araya stated in numerous interviews. "I have a strong religious belief, but I don't attend church. Rituals are not something I follow. Although I do believe in God, it is the extent of my religion. No radicalism or revolt, simply a modest, private, and unassuming belief." Araya simply grinned when asked about the inconsistency between his religious beliefs and Slayer's songs, which range from South of Heaven to Disciple. We're asking questions rather than preaching, and that's also a component of faith. Not only to believe, but to confront your fears. Sandra Araya and Tom Araya were married in 1995. Women who supported him during the most turbulent years of Slayer's life. They weren't an ostentatious couple. Sandra was not a red carpet walker. No scandals, no interviews. However, it was she who kept the family together during the years that Araya was traveling the world. While Slayer was at its height, they had two children, Tomas Enrique Araya Jr. and Arielesa Araya. Araya has acknowledged that he missed a lot of significant childhood events, which was a major factor in his decision to retire. It took a lot of music. I want to give back now, though. With presents, not cash or presents. I would like to have breakfast with my children. Every day I want to see them grow. Tom Araya didn't create a music business, buy a mansion, or return to Los Angeles after Slayer broke up. He went with a completely other option, a ranch in Texas, where the sky is infinite, the terrain is huge, and no one knows that he was the man who stood in front of thousands of people during a metal storm. He and his spouse tend to cows, pigs, chickens, ducks, and sheepdogs there every morning. When he toured, Sandra used to handle everything. He is the one working now. No bodyguards or helpers, just rough hands and a basic pace of living. Tom Araya. Now, at twilight, the voice of rain and blood herds cattle back to the barn, carefully scoops grain, and checks the water temperature for the hens. Here, nobody screams. No necessity exists. Tom Araya made the decision to take a back seat and live in a world where legends frequently succumb to the pressures of fame. Although he isn't very wealthy, he doesn't need to worry because his estimated money from record tours and Slayer memorabilia is between $15 and $20 million. More significantly, he possesses something that many artists never do. Calm. Not forced out due to debt. Addiction does not ruin. Not separated. Not in a desperate need to go back on stage. He just lives. And no Grammy can compare to that triumph. Legacy and impact in a genre rife with flaming personalities, startling declarations, band dissolutions, and premature deaths, Tom Araya stood silently, like a sturdy pillar in the middle of the earthquake. He wasn't Slayer's lead songwriter, he wasn't the most skilled bassist, and he didn't create thrash metal. But when the spotlight fell on Slayer, he was the voice, the face, and the longest shadow. Tom Araya was the only member of Slayer who remained constant during the band's nearly 40-year existence, despite changes in drummers, conflicts within the label, and later Jeff Hanneman's passing. No demands, no impetuous outbursts, no political involvement, no moral problems, and no attacks on others on social media. Tom Araya realized that the stage was the only location where his voice needed to be heard, thus he didn't need to shout off stage in a band notorious for its visual and oral brutality. From Angel of Death to War Ensemble, from Disciple to Deadskin Mask, Araya's scream was more than simply a noise, it was eerie. A cry that didn't break. Never wasted a word or lost a beat. Araya placed his voice front and center, a voice of disdain, judgment, and occasionally hopelessness, in a genre where vocals are frequently used as filler between riffs and drumming. He wasn't a frontman when he sang. He made a lasting impression on the listener's mind with his screams, which sounded like a figure pulled from out of their dreams. Being an icon was never Tom Araya's goal. Strangely enough, though, he became one because he didn't try. Metal bands of many generations, including Lamb of God, Gojira, and Code Orange, speak of Araya with an odd sense of awe. He was the most genuine, not because he was the loudest. Tom doesn't have to take the lead. He merely remains still. And everything revolves around him. Lamb of God, Randy Blythe. Slayer was once disapproved of by reviewers, charged with heresy, and prohibited from performing. However, time has shown that what is true endures. And the most authentic aspect of Slayer was Tom Araya. He never apologized, never followed fashion, and never flattered with his shout. Tom Araya consistently has the same uncanny appearance in thousands of live images of Slayer. Standing in the middle, with icy eyes, a sardonic smirk, and a stance that defies all forms of submission. He never wore high-end clothing, changed his hair, or waved like a politician. The crowd erupted at the sight of a single, dagger-eyed look from the stage. No declarations, no gimmicks. The legacy of Tom Araya lies not in his popularity but rather in the utmost respect he receives from the metal community as a whole. He doesn't have the most followers. However, the first picture that springs to mind when Slayer is discussed is Araya. He is the exclamation point at the conclusion of every blood-soaked hymn Slayer ever penned, not because he sought to make a statement. Tom Araya is an unwavering individual who screams and stares. Despite his many cries of dying, Tom Araya never allowed himself to perish in the spotlight. He did not succumb to addiction like Lane Staley or die early like Cliff Burton. Didn't lose control like Axl Rose, didn't conflict with the media, and didn't become a social media meme. He simply left in silence. Tom Araya steered through the harsh decades of metal like a helicopter flying low during a storm, never crashing. He didn't stay out of the dark. He confronted it, even welcomed it, sang about it, and ultimately found peace again. Araya just stood there, and every eye was drawn to him in a society where artists believe they have to do more, shout louder, and rebel harder to be noticed. He didn't have to make political remarks, preach, or fight for justice. He left behind a sensation rather than words. The sensation that someone was there, yelling things you couldn't utter, and then moving aside to let you face your own reality alone. Tom Araya is now without a microphone on a peaceful Texas ranch. He has a shovel in his hand. He no longer yells in front of a boisterous crowd. A chicken lost in the bushes is called to buy him. All he needs is the sound of the wind blowing by the porch every night. He doesn't need praise. Thus, the most horrific scream in the history of thrash metal got ingrained in fans' hearts like a whisper. To exist, you don't have to keep performing or stand in the middle of the city to echo. Tom Araya, a symbol that shines without stage lights, is still present. Where did you hear Tom Araya shout for the first time? Under flaming stage lights, on an ancient cassette tape, or during a lonely period of your own life? Post a comment. Tell us what you think. Please hit the notification bell, like the video, and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy stories like this. We remain here, telling the tales that no one else is willing to share. We discuss more than simply legends. Rock has never been silent, thus word by word, note by note, step by step, we bring their souls back. And the reason it doesn't have to be is because of you.